Sakampanayu, Mishun, Natui Uskwa, Natasuis, Shinnecock, Montauk, Natchashiawank. My given name is I lead canoe, I am butterfly woman. I come from the people known as the people of the Stony Shores, Long Island, New York. The language that I just spoke actually was the first language that the settlers, when they first greeted the shores of Long Island, that was the language that they heard from our people, and we are still on those shores in Long Island. I'd like to give a living land acknowledgement to the Muskogee people whose lands I'm currently standing on. I'd like to acknowledge them and thank them for preserving and protecting the ancient knowledge of these lands, and for doing the responsibility of being a steward to not only the lands and the voiceless, such as the birds, the finned, the four-legged, and the trees and the plant life, and all of those that do not have a voice, the Muskogee people whose lands we stand on today, they are still those original stewards. By doing this living land acknowledgement, I remind myself of my responsibility to the land and to the water and to other people, because the earth is alive, and I am medicine to the land and to the water and to each other. We as Indigenous people, we are medicine to the land and to the water, and it is our responsibility to speak up for the voiceless, to teach one another, and by doing this, we save our world for humankind. But to do this, we have to know what our ancient histories are, what our ancient teachings are. And by doing this, we share this orally through generation after generation after generation after generation. And there was a time where we had an interruption into this way of life. And that interruption made it very challenging for us to still be the stewards of these lands and of these waters. But it is the plight of Indigenous people today that is calling to action all people to stand up for our land and our water and this planet. And so through that oral history that was shared, I gained that oral history from my mother. When I was a little girl, I learned how to swim in the Shinnecock Bay. My mother would swim so far out, and I would swim on her back, and she would swim very, very, very far out. Good thing she could swim, and I was holding on to her back. And as we swam, she would dive under so I could really get that water in me and really, really submerge myself in the water. And she would take me to a place in the water, and she would stand up, and she would take me off her back, and we would stand up, and I would look around, and we would be standing in the middle of the Shinnecock Bay. And she would teach me about the sandbars that existed through her entire lifetime. She would teach me about what it meant to be a Shinnecock woman, where to go and find the best clams, where to go and know where to harvest all of these different things that have preserved us. She talked about the times where she used to learn how to swim from her uncles and her dads and her aunts in the Shinnecock Bay. And as I got a little older, when we would go in the summers and we would swim, I wasn't quite strong enough to swim alongside her yet, but yet I was a little too big to swim on her back. So I had to watch her swim out to the places that she used to take me to. And there was a day where she would keep swimming and swimming and swimming, and she would swim and come up and swim and come up and swim and come up. And what I realized was she couldn't find those sandbars. And it scared me, because I thought at that moment that I could lose my mother. I thought that at that moment my mother could drown because the sandbars were no longer. And it was at that moment that we both witnessed and experienced something called bioterrorism. We experienced the interruption of our lives that our ancestors experienced. As I stand here today and have learned what climate justice is, what climate change is, what environmental sustainability is, I realized that my mother taught me what being medicine to the land and water was just by giving me that experience of swimming with the land and with the water. Because I always say that if something was to happen to the Shinnecock people of the Stony Shore, then something would happen to that Stony Shore. And if something happens to the Stony Shore, then something's going to happen to Southampton. And if something happens to Southampton in Long Island, then something's going to happen to New York. And if something happens to New York, then something's going to happen to the rest of the world. You see, Indigenous people are medicine to the land and the water. And we have a strong responsibility to pass down this knowledge from generation to generation to generation to generation. So with that ancient knowledge that my mother passed down to me, I want to share with the world on what this responsibility is. But first, let's go back. Let's go back to a time where there wasn't interruption in our world. There wasn't destruction to the land and to the water. Let's go back to a time where we lived freely as Indigenous people all around the world. Imagine trees that were so tall, like so tall, that a squirrel could literally hop from tree to tree to tree to tree from Nova Scotia, Canada, all the way down into the Carolinas without ever touching the ground. Imagine how strong those trees were. And the languages that our Indigenous people spoke under those trees, the mycelial network of these trees and forests were connected to us. When the settlers approached and they explored what is known as the Americas or the New World, they described our forests to be very giving and like spring-like. They said that they could literally run underneath the canopies of the trees and the ground gave. It gave like a track. And that was because our ancestors understood what a biocentric lifestyle was. We lived in harmony with the earth. We had controlled burns that we had during the rotation of our migration of being semi-nomadic. We controlled the burns, and that burning of the woods actually helped to give nitrogen back into the soil. See, everything that we did, we didn't take anything. We always gave back. So there was a rotation. Our clothes were made up of feathers and deerskin and plant fibers. We had traditional food ways that we migrated with the seasons. We ate with the seasons. We fished with the seasons. We foraged with the seasons. We hunted with the seasons. We respected one another. We had ancient trade routes that we traveled by carbon neutral vessels, watercrafts that didn't disturb the marine life, that didn't disturb the natural ocean sustainability. We helped to aid that ocean sustainability. And these are things that our waters still remember as we practice, just like that story I talked about with my mother teaching me how to swim and being a part of the ocean sustainability. See, our DNA remembers those things. So as I'm telling you this story, we're unlocking a genetic memory that has been blocked because we have experienced an interruption. See, we shared different things with each other, from trading different types of plants and seeds, such as the cannabis seed and the hemp seed. These are ancient trade industries that we've had for thousands and thousands of years that not only have sustained our life and our bodies, but has sustained the environment. But the interruption came when we began to share it with a people that did not view us as humans. And when that happened, there was an abrupt interruption in our entire lifestyle. Just like that story of the sandbars not being there. Our ancestors felt like they were drowning in a time of almost 500 years. That interruption caused laws to be made against our way of living. I call it laws against our way of living. The controlled burns were outlawed. We can no longer have controlled burns. Therefore, the forests started to grow diseases that we could not help to heal. and it started to kill off indigenous plants. A lot of times when we think about colonization or assimilation, we always think about the culture of the people, but we don't think about what happened to the interruption of the environment. You see, if we foraged with the seasons and we hunted with the seasons and those became illegal to do, then the environment no longer was getting what it needed from the indigenous people who are medicine to the earth. The languages were outlawed to speak. The mycelial network in the water and the marine life that responded to our languages, to our songs, and to our ceremonies could no longer hear that, could no longer have that connection with the people that cared about them. So that interruption wasn't just an interruption into our lifestyle, but it was an interruption to the planet. This interruption caused slavery and indentured servitude and residential schools. At the age of 3, a child could be kidnapped and taken from their home and forcefully put into a school system or an indentured servitude so that their parents could monetarily figure out a way to pay for their house, because we could no longer live in a house that didn't interrupt the land. You see, we didn't put holes in the ground and put concrete walls against the ground that blocked our connection to the mycelial network. We lived harmony on top of the ground, but that was illegal to do. So we had to forcefully be put into this system that interrupted our way of life. Not only that, it caused genetic trauma. It caused generational trauma. So the passing down of oral history and knowledge started to somewhat disintegrate and fade. But now we're in a time where each generation that has experienced this has found some sort of resilience to stand up and resurge and revitalize our languages, our traditional practices, from how we raise our children to the school systems that we put in. We have found a way to have a plight to return back this ancient knowledge. Not only that, it's not about returning this for indigenous people, but if indigenous people maintain a vast amount, I believe 80% or over 80% of the global biodiversity, and we make up less than 2% of the human population, the resiliency and the plight for this is not just for indigenous people, but it's for all people. But indigenous people who are medicine have not stopped preserving the earth. And those laws that were created against our way of living, we are now living in a time where we are being very innovative on how we protect and preserve the earth. We are living in a time where we are physically putting our bodies on the line to stop the rare earth minerals that are being drilled out of the earth, the pipelines that are being created, the oil that is being fracked out of the earth. We are putting our lives on the line to stop that. And that is not just for the sake of having something that we have always had, but this is for the sake of saving the world. We are being very creative in how we are creating our economies again and returning and reclaiming our industries. You're beginning to see agriculture thrive in ways that we are now using the language in our grow houses, in our greenhouses, in our farmlands. We're able to utilize the same language that these land-race seeds have remembered. And now we are revitalizing a plant such as cannabis to heal the world with indigenous sovereignty. But we are still up against fighting the laws that have now been created for us to not be a part of these industries. You see, it's super important that we don't only realize that this is not just an indigenous problem, but if it is the mothers that bear children and through their DNA from umbilical cord to umbilical cord to umbilical cord to umbilical cord that they have taught this ancient wisdom. We are living in a time where we are still standing up to protect the woman, the missing, murdered, and indigenous women that are now being killed and raped at a high rate. We are at a plight to return back this ancient wisdom so that we can all come together. And it is through that that we are finding innovation happen. And these are through products such as digital products. We're now living in a digital world where people are forgetting the importance that we have and responsibility that we have to the natural environment, to go and harvest and pick cedar and pick sage and use your tobacco and understand what creating a bundle is for you and what that is for the environment. You see, if we make this into a digital place where we can create ebooks, we can enter the metaverse, we can trade with cryptocurrency, understanding how to integrate in these ways, we can now also awaken the genetic memory of people that are in that space that have long forgotten about our responsibility. You see, Indigenous people being medicine to the land and to the water, we can enter any space to remind other people that they too are land, are medicine to the land and the water. And that's what this is. This is something for all of us. This isn't just an Indigenous problem. This isn't just a Black problem. This isn't just a white problem. This is a human issue that we have to address. And it is the coming together. But it's very important to understand that that ancient wisdom that we carry as Indigenous people, that we have taught to our children, that hasn't been interrupted, that is what we have to preserve. And that is what we have to protect. And that is what we all have to come together to communicate with one another and share our stories. So there's a call to action, and this call to action is that recognize that Indigenous people are medicine. Allow them to heal not only the environment, but you as well. Because once that happens and you become healed, then you do the same and you share with other people.